I had a funny experience once. I got invited by an off-group course. This is before um, vaping became a major harm reduction technique. I was invited by a vaping group to speak in Liverpool at the International Harm Reduction Conference. And I began by doing a routine. And the routine was this, Zach. I'll let you in on it. We could sort of play act it. The 1964 Surgeon General's report, which announced to the world that smoking caused cancer, didn't say that smoking was addictive. In fact, it said it wasn't addictive. It said it was habituating. How did my international harm reduction audience react to that claim? Would you guess?
So your claim that in the Surgeon General in the 60s, 64, I think you said, had a warning on it that smoking was cancer causing, but it wasn't addictive.
They wrote a whole report about this. Yeah, they had a whole section about how smoking wasn't addictive.
Right.
They shouted out, well, of course, all of the researchers were in the hands of the tobacco company.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, right. Just like big pharma is to blame for opioid addiction. Right.
I said, you're such, and then I walk on a thin edge every time I present. I said, you're such hippie communists. A bunch of researchers come out and say that smoking causes cancer. And you think that they're in the rear pocket of the tobacco companies. Does that really make sense to you? And a couple of people afterwards said, man, you've got guts, because you're sort of taunting. I'm taunting the audience. I'm saying your thinking is locked in to this, well, let's just blame the tobacco companies for everything. And the more underlying thing that I have to point out is the meaning of addiction. I mean, I wrote a book called The Meaning of Addiction. Changes. And smoking, in some essential way, wasn't addictive when sort of everybody smoked and you could smoke in a meeting and nobody minded. It didn't have addictive qualities. Now, you got to it. If harm reduction people, like everybody else, thinks, well, smoking is addictive. That's a thing. You smoke and you become addicted and you can't not smoke. Despite the fact that people quit smoking all the time, including a majority of the audience. And, you know, somebody, Robin Room calls me a radical social constructivist by showing that the very meaning of addiction changes. And so, you know, in the 1960s, heroin was addictive, and that's a guy in a back alley in a trench coat shooting up and being a total social alien. But regular people, like if you see the show Mad Men, the leading people in the world were smokers. And so smoking in that arena wasn't actually addictive. And that concept, people think they're radical because, tobacco companies, they're bad. But the actual radical way of thinking is to understand how addiction is tied into the woof of and weave of actual life experience at a given point in history.
Are you thinking that it was so commonplace, and because nobody had to, it was not imposed on anybody that they needed to pivot for one reason or another from their smoking behavior, that people just kind of went in and out of it? So truly, this is not an addictive involvement. It's just a thing that people did that they could take or leave.
If you go to Europe, they have something we're going to get into this, whether we have it in America. There's sort of non-addictive smoking. You know, you'll watch a movie and some people sort of say, oh, we have a cigarette, and they'll say, oh, okay, or they'll have it after a meal. In Europe, smoking, they've never gotten addiction quite, for the most part, as thorough as we have. And in part, it's the convincing yourself that smoking is addictive that makes it addictive. Although I remember having a conversation with our good friend Howard Josepher, and he used to be a TC guy, therapeutic immunity, And they used to say, you know, just because you're quitting heroin, you can still drink and smoke. And they used to give out cigarettes. And Howard's a man who knows something about addiction. And then I said, well, and then they came to realize after the Surgeon General's report, they couldn't do that. And I say, well, you know, was that tough? And Howard said, Howard, who was a man who was a hardcore heroin addict, said, well, not for me. I just quit. You know, when I sort of saw that, I just, well, we've got to stop smoking. And I stopped. Now, obviously, there's a broad range of responses to that. But there are people who never really, smoking was never really their axe. One of my favorite figures in the world, you know, unfortunately, Eddie Fisher was famous. He's a little Jewish boy from my neighborhood in South Philadelphia who became world famous. And then he married Elizabeth Taylor, and he had some hit songs. And then after that, his life became less interesting. But at one point, he had a television show, and they made him smoke all the time. And then, you know, he hated it. And even though he himself became addicted to amphetamines at one point in his life, he was so glad to get rid of the smoking. And it's fascinating because Carrie Fisher, his daughter, reflected on my dad still smokes marijuana in his 50s and 60s. Eddie Fisher, for the better or for worse, lived into his 80s, and Carrie Fisher died of a heart attack in her early 60s, combining drugs she wasn't supposed to be taking. She's a lead figure in the recovery movement along with pharmaceuticals. And so the flexibility of the notion of addiction and how it changes over time is something that people want to have a category, addictive, and it's platonic ideal. It's real. And we believe addictions are real, but it's an essential component of it is the social, cultural, and cognitive aspect of it. So it's unbelievable. And we wrote Love and Addiction in 1975, and we said smoking was addictive. It wasn't until 1988 that the Surgeon General of the United States officially issued a report, 1988, saying that smoking was addictive. And the Surgeon General hates tobacco. They called it cancer causing in 1964. And it was a 618-page report discussing new breakthrough data on scientific addiction findings that synthesized the work of more than 50 scientists and 2,000 scientific articles to decide that smoking was addictive. And we just have to reflect on what does that mean, that they had to have all this research. Couldn't you just tell smoking was addictive? Didn't people? I mean, I remember when I was a kid and I was in the back seat of a woman who was driving us somewhere, and I opened up the ashtray and it was full of cigarette butts. And I said, oh, chain smoker. Who didn't understand that was addictive? And the answer was, well, people didn't understand in that context. And in a certain sense, not being addictive was the truth. So let's jump to the present. So we now know that smoking's addictive. Everybody knows that now. And just as we've learned that, something strange has happened. And that brings up a radical question: is smoking still addictive? Because there was a revolution when smoking became addictive, and then in secondhand smoke became a revolution, and you were forbidden from smoking in many places. An amazing thing happened. People cut back how many cigarettes they smoked. And you sort of say, well, wait a second. If you're addicted to cigarettes, you don't cut back. And even people who believe that you can cut back alcohol say, well, you can't cut back cigarettes. But then worldwide and in America, people cut back cigarettes. And so the research shows that, you know, to be a smoking addict, you used to have to smoke like a pack a day, 20 cigarettes a day. And now people say, I'm a smoker, but they smoke maybe 6 cigarettes a day. Are they addicted?
Who knows? It's something that they do.
And it's sort of like, you sort of are not allowed to be a smoking addict now because they won't let you in a building. You know, if you want to have a job or if you want to be married, you have to go outside and smoke. And people do that. And you do see a small group of people puffing away in some hallway. And you said to think, well, those are the real addicts. But there's a ton of people gradually, or sometimes rather immediately, stop being smoking addicts because they showed the ability, which is supposedly impossible for an addicted person, to delay actually smoking. Right. And so say to somebody, oh, are you addicted to smoking? They'll say, yes, unfortunately, I smoke every day. And then you might go, well, how many cigarettes do you smoke? And they might say, well, you know, I smoke 4 or 5 or 6. And if you're I'm 76 years old, you would go, well, that's not a smoking addict, like a real smoking addict. And the only people who can really be a smoking addict are people who are completely unstructured and have a completely free, they can do whatever they want, which is often street people, ironically, because smoking cigarettes are expensive.
There are people who just sort of do things and they're happy, let's say smoking. They smoke because they want to, and they smoke when they want to. It's not really, doesn't really cause very much impairment, you know, an impediment to their daily lives. And there are people who do things because they think they need it. They must have this thing or do this thing to function in all of the dimensions of their life. You know, they're distracted by other areas of their life, their work, their interactions with other people because they need to get back to this thing. And like you say, there's just sort of, you kind of know that. You meet people and you kind of realize through their behavior that they're too into one activity or another.
Behavior, because both of those groups of people
attitude
might be smoking 5 or 6 cigarettes a day, and one of them is feeling differently about that same habit. One of the great things about DSM-5 is DSM-5 doesn't use the word addiction, and it doesn't even use the word dependence. It doesn't say, oh, if you smoke, it has substance use disorders. It doesn't say, well, if you drink 5 or 8 or 12 alcohol shots a day, it has no quantitative thing. It has how badly is it detracting from your life. And there's also an essential self element in it, which is what you just described. Well, do I feel I can exist with this? Is this an essential point in my life? And if you sort of don't believe that about yourself, that's called denial, actually, in AA. But that feeling that it's not crucial to your existence is actually a strongly differentiating factor.
Well, so because I imagine somebody who smokes because they like to, but do not feel it's crucial to their existence, isn't that just logically the person who would have a much easier time cutting down smoking or stopping smoking if that's what they felt like they needed to do, like the next day? If they learn that they have some sort of a health deficit and smoking is just adding to it, well, that's a person who's going to have a much easier time. That's not part of their sense of self, right? So it makes sense. That's an attitude.
Where would you say you scored on that scale when you had a heroin bag? Where would you say that you were on that scale?
Yeah, I call myself addicted. I thought of heroin as something that I always thought of it as something that I hoped that I'd move on from, but I couldn't imagine getting on for too long of a period of time without doing heroin. I needed it for a variety of things. I felt I needed it for a variety of things in order to be a fully functioning self.
You really needed it for your life. And then at some point, you didn't think that for whatever reason.
That's right. Right.
And that was the essential change. I mean, you even continued using heroin for a little bit, but you lost its essentialness. And that brings up the Department of Health and Human Services did a long series of things about smoking. And as I pointed out in 1964, they said smoking causes cancer, but it wasn't addictive, and everybody's screaming so. And it wasn't until 1988 a quarter of a century later, they said, smoking is addictive. We've done a ton of research. And then there's a more amazing document than that. In 2002, Department of Health and Human Services released something called Those Who Continue to Smoke. And if you say, 1964 said smoking causes cancer. And then more than half of the people who were habitual smokers, the rate of smoking went from above 40% to below 20%. And then they said, well, who continues to smoke? So the smoking declined. Many people nonetheless continued to smoke. In 2002, DHHS released Smoking and Tobacco Control Monograph number 15, Those Who Continue to Smoke. Research in the volume explored whether remaining smokers were more addicted in strictly biological terms than quitters, whether they had different biological or personality profiles, or whether cigarettes had somehow become more chemically addictive. And here's what they summarize. Despite great efforts, researchers in the volume found surprisingly, none of the papers presents compelling evidence that any of these things is the case. There's no more radical thinker, as maybe our interactions will describe, about addiction than me, but even I had to take a step back when I read that. So you figure, well, okay, some people keep smoking. Everybody knows it's bad. People disapprove of it. And you might say, well, they were more addicted. Well, they weren't. The ones who quit and the ones who didn't quit weren't more dependent on it. Well, they must have some kind of basic underlying psychological dependence profile. Well, they didn't find that either. And so you get down to something which sounds, remarkably, empirical. Well, some people quit and some people didn't quit. And, and the funny thing about it, and this has been found out even in further research with every kind of drug, a steady percentage of people quit each form of addiction over the life course of that addiction. It's not like, of course, that means that the largest bunch quit in the beginning because the largest bunch is doing it. But it's sort of like, well, if 50% of the people quit smoking in a couple of years after the Surgeon General's report, well, that's, if 50 million Americans are smoking, that's 25 million people quit. And then the next period, it's going to be, it's 12 million people quit, and then it's going to get smaller and smaller, but it's the same kind of a function. And in terms of existential terms, what happens is, for whatever reason, as people go along in their life process, they reach a point where they either become capable of, or they need to, or they develop some kind of an essential ability to quit, and that happens at a different pace for different people throughout their life cycles.
If you ask I just always laugh, and you think about these scientific findings that are hard to read, and then you ask, all right, so what does this imply? And you just go one up with the same answer that you would get if you looked around.
If you knew nothing, it's the way I call it is Bubba's psychology. If you ask your grandmother, why do people quit smoking? She says, well, some people, they decide it's bad for them, and they don't decide it younger. Some most later they decide it. It's just like, right. Sometimes it seems as though the less you know about the science of it, the more readily you'll be able to do things. And that helps in doing therapy. When you go to somebody, you don't have a theory about why they overeat or why they smoke or why they're a heroin addict. You just relate to them in the here and now of their lives. And you say, well, okay, you've been addicted for a really long time, okay. And you've done X, Y, and Z, and it's, that's a bad idea. But, let's just talk about your life now. And, maybe you're a grandmother now. and you're worried about your grandchildren in a way that you weren't. That comes out in Hillbilly Elegy. His grandmother raised him to be a solid citizen, but she was a wreck when she raised his mother, who herself had mental health and addiction problems her whole life. And her mother, his mother's mother, was part of that process. But then when his grandmother raised him, she produced a self-respecting, high-achieving, conservative. So there's no reason, there's no fundamental thing either about addiction, about the substance, or about the person that prevents you from making an inroad at any point in their life to getting them to change.
Radical.